sort it out. It's a little off. All right, so we're going to start live streaming, and now what I've done in the past is I've tried to live stream at different times. I'm going to continue to do that. So it is 8:50 a.m. in my time and the East Coast in the United States. I don't know what that means for other people. It probably means people on the West Coast are not going to be watching this. Very few on the East Coast will be watching this, but maybe I'll get some people like more European kind of audience. What I'm going to do is just start answering questions as people join me, and I'm going to go through a list of questions because I asked like what broader themes on the community tab last week. What broader themes can I ask? And I will answer those unless other questions pop up first. When other questions pop up first, I'll address whoever's talking immediately, and that way we'll I want to I want to scratch where you itch. So I'll answer whatever questions you have about anything related to Ukraine. So here we go with so my question that I posed to the crowd on my community tab said I was asked if I could speak to some broader themes about Ukraine. I'm not sure what that viewer meant. What would you like to hear? And I got some good answers, and I actually started working on some. So, for example, somebody was asking me about propaganda, Western propaganda, and I asked for some qualification, and then I started actually doing some research and reading not reading, watching some more of Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter and other stuff like that. And I'm actually going to do a video about that shortly. So that got me going down a good path. So another question. I really like the news reading that you do and respective analysis for different styles. I look to other channels, but you're quite unique in your style. I also appreciate the daily report. This is important for me. If you need more lenses to read the news, I would appreciate an EU versus US perspective. And so I've tried to do that when I did, and I'm no longer trying to do daily news updates. I'm trying to hit broader themes that will have a greater impact on people's thinking about things, because the daily update is it's good, but it goes stale in 2 days. Like 2 days later, nobody really wants to watch that again. And so like what can I do that will magnify its presence? But when I did that, I would make sure that I was looking at, not just the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and other U.S. sources, but I would also look at now it's a U.S. source, but Radio Free Europe, and then I'd look at the Guardian, and then I'd look at other Interfact Ukraine and all kinds of other sources that were giving a different perspective of France 24, German papers, things along those lines, so that I would see things from multiple perspectives, because it does color the way, which country it comes from, does color the way that you see the news. So I have done that, and I continue to do that, but I didn't. I haven't done that for a while. Oh, General Armageddon. What do I think Russia's retaliatory actions will be when NATO deploys DPU in Ukraine? Um, I don't think that Russia's going to do anything, General. I think that Russia has been bluffing the entire time about every red line, because they're far weaker than we thought that they were initially. When Russia invaded this time, well, a year and a month ago last year, when Russia invaded, we all thought, wow, this is over. It's going to be quick. It's going to be done in no time. This is the second army in the world. And they pants themselves before the world. That's pretty much what happened. So there's no really not a red line. What Russia has done they have, I'll give them credit for having deterred the US and Western nations for a long time by bluffing, but they're not going to actually do anything. Okay, next question was Thinker ARU said a few interesting questions or topics I would find interesting are the contents of the Minsk agreements. Yes, I'm going to go back and look at the actual Minsk agreements and unpack the Minsk agreements. But if I'm doing that, I'm going to have to go back and unpack the Budapest memorandum, which is Also very important because in the Budapest Memorandum, the U.S., the EU, or sorry, the U.S., the U.K., and Russia guaranteed Ukraine's sovereign borders if Ukraine gave up their nukes. And Russia, as you know, it was the violator here. So um, we have to do that first and then unpack the Minsk agreement. But it might even be helpful to look at the UN Charter between those and try to understand those in like a sequence of those five, because there's like a number of things that have been violated here, not just the Minsk agreements. But Russian trolls will always just go the Minsk agreements, and so that's why we ought to do that. Another question was, are the recent events in Georgia somehow related to Ukraine? Probably, but not directly. I don't believe. And if somebody else knows that, tell me about that. By the way, if you're here watching, please ask questions if you have questions. Um, yeah, so Stephen Cole just popped up and said, "What are your views on the happenings in Georgia? I think this is the possibility of really blowing up." Yeah, I don't think it's directly related. Like it's not, but it's a cousin. Because what happened in Georgia in 2008 was a very similar kind of deal. I don't know enough about it to know whether what's going to happen, or what has happened in Georgia is going to become broader, or if it'll just be suppressed or whatever. But it would be, I think, fantastic for Ukraine if a number of Soviet satellites, or Soviet uh, oblast territories, republics, whatever they're named different things depending on their status, um, would rise. And these Russians, they haven't been treating us well, and they keep talking about we have this this right to our independent state, as they're claiming with Donbass. I would think would be fascinating for a number of them to rise up within Russia and detract from what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. General Armageddon is back, and he says, "Are you aware that the last missile strikes were the response to Ukraine killing two civilians in Bryansk and shooting an 11-year-old boy in the back?" So, General, I know you're a Russian troll who has been here before, causing all kinds of other trouble, but I will answer you because the response to the missile strikes was and the killing of or shooting of an 11-year-old boy in the back was proven to be a fabrication, as far as I understand. A Not a Ukrainian act, but a some kind of false flag or something along those lines. So, with that being said, I'm not really interested in continuing that kind of line of reasoning with you. But again, it's going to be impossible to prove that to somebody who has already bought that and thinks that that's where things are. So I'm going to skip you from now on, General. So yeah, it's not it's irrational to try to reason with an irrational person. So Yuri says, if Ukrainian soldiers would start revenging Russians with brutality sometimes, how could it affect support from the West? Yuri, that is a absolutely freaking brilliant question, because this was my great concern when I saw the video of the guy being like, I had other stuff in the can that I was going to post that I haven't posted yet because I had to pause and address how absolutely brutal and unnecessary it was to shoot that guy. He's just standing there smoking a cigarette, unarmed, and they shoot him down in cold blood, and it makes my blood boil. I'm sure it makes the Ukrainians' blood boil as well. And somebody said, "Well, now there's going to be no quarter. They're going to, do it too." And I hope not, because if they do it too, and is captured on film, that can separate. Um, that can separate the Western supporters from Ukraine, saying, "Oh, you're giving your opponent a reason to say, see, they're doing the same thing as well." You can't do that. You simply have to rise above. You have to be the bigger whatever. And I know that's very, very difficult to say, or very difficult to do. It's easy to say, but you can't go and do that kind of retribution as well. Now, it will provide them a stronger reason to fight, because if you get captured, then you're looking at something potentially like that. But you can't do the atrocities back, or you lose the moral high ground. So. Um, All right, next one. Drifting Cowboy says, Professor, do you think that the United States really wants Ukraine to win against Russia? It looks to me like the old military hardware they're receiving prefer a stalemate. No, I do think they really want them to win. Um, so what they're sending strategically, like from the stuff that we have in mothballs, or things that are things that will be useful, and preferably if you can couple those two things together, you really have something. So you're trying to get rid of old stale inventory while providing things that they need, while not crossing this red line that the Russians are complaining about, like, don't send these drones or it's a red line, don't send these rockets or it's a red line, don't send these tanks or it's a red line, don't send these jets. That's where we are now. And right now what they're trying to do is figure out how to arm MiGs with F-16 missiles, if that will work. And I read an article about that just this morning. So they're but every time the Russians do this, there's a red line that's going to cause World War III. So they're trying to not do that. And so yeah. So at any rate, I don't believe that the administration is trying to help Ukraine not win. I think they're trying to help them win without stepping over something that triggers World War III. And this is a really difficult balancing act, and simultaneously not lose the allies as well. Hello, more of you who've come in. If you have questions, just pop them in, and I'll try to answer your questions. I'll give you priority. Um, so I hope that answers the question. Paul says, "What's Georgia's options now?" I really don't know. I don't know that Georgia has the same strength. So Georgia is about 3 million people. It's like the size of Lithuania. In contrast, Ukraine. So that's like the size of West Virginia. Let's put it like that to give you a sense. If you're European, you think Lithuania or Georgia, 3 million. That makes more sense. If you're American, about the size of West Virginia. Ukraine's roughly the size of Texas. Okay, and they have a population of some 40 some odd million. Now it's down to 30, low 30 million, because a lot of people have fled the country. Mostly women and children have fled the country. Men have to stay. But it's so just to give you a difference in size. So Georgia's not like this great big ally, but another front that the Russians have to worry about is a problem if they can create a problem, and that I think that's a great thing. I I want the Russians to be diffused. One of the reasons you remember lion tamers, right? They walk in with a chair and a whip. In part, as I understand, the chair, and this could be just metaphorical, but even if it's metaphorical, it still works. The reason they have the chair is because they have the 4 points on the chair, and the lion can't focus on which point to focus on, because that's not the way that their brain works. And I think that would be also a tricky thing for the Russians as well. Okay. Marie O, I'm late. Hot dang. Hello, everyone. Hello, Marie. Welcome. Hello, all. Missed a start. Don't worry about it. I have just been trying to experiment with different times for a live stream. So it's not like I've warned anyone and said, hey, at this time, I'm going to be there. And the reason that I uh, said that was because, like, don't worry about it. I'm just trying to see when this gets traction. Okay. Um, so let's see. Aro Newham, do you think that Russian occupied regions of Georgia and Moldova will become eventual part of the eventual peace deal? Um, so my crystal ball doesn't really work. I can't. I have a hard time predicting the future, and I really don't like saying anything I can't say very with great clarity, based on, hey, I've researched this. This is a nerdy, like, professor's kind of habit, where I have to prove my sources. um, because there are so many and I say that because I want to say this: there are so many variables that I can't say whether Georgia and Moldova would become part of the eventual peace deal, because there's too many things that can confound whether it would or wouldn't. It depends. Are they active? Did they become active combatants in the process? Did they whatever? It depends. It depends on how weakened the Russians are by the time that we get down, how degraded they are by the time that we get down to the end of the war. Um, I do believe that they have to end this by so degrading the Russian forces that Russia has to go, you know what, we give up. What are your terms? And not just slither back into Russia and stop doing what they're doing. That would be a victory, but that would be a terrible victory. You need them to actually come to the table, sign an agreement that lets them get their children back, let alone all the other things um, that they have to sort out. Like, for example, to rebuild Ukraine, if the Russians aren't beaten clearly on the battlefield, then you know who's going to rebuild Ukraine? The West, who's already provided all their money, or Russian oil, or Russian oil only if they have been so degraded that they have to sign that. Okay, do you think the Russian occupied region? Oh, we just said that. Stephen Cole says, and Belarus is the size of Oklahoma, and Poland is the size of New Mexico. Yeah, so Belarus is another wild card as well. The people in Belarus are not excited about fighting Russia's war. The people almost overthrew Lukashenko a few years ago, and Russia came in to stabilize for Lukashenko, and so he's beholden to Putin. I don't know that his military is going to want to get into the fight because they've taken Russian tanks and other Russian equipment. So that tells me that they're not primed. And ISW says the same thing with that. So I wouldn't worry about that. Okay, let me get to the back to the questions that I have here until more questions pop up, and I will go back to your questions. The 2 dozen or so of you that are here right now, I will go back to your questions before answering my own. But here we are. So a few interesting questions that I would like to find interesting are the contents of the Minsk agreements. Are the recent events in Georgia somehow related to Ukraine? And that's what you were asking about. A series of episodes about leaders of other countries and their views on Ukraine, including controversial ones. Such as Orban and how he suddenly became pro Russian after a trip to Moscow, and other interesting figures are ex German Chancellor Schroeder, and who's now working for Gazprom. Yeah, Schroeder kind of created part of what the problem is. So did Merkel with the link to the pipeline. By the way, the pipeline, it looks like it wasn't a the evidence that seems to be coming out now, it looks like it wasn't a nation state actor. It was a private group. As far as the most recent evidence is, when it first came out, I thought, okay, the U.S. isn't kicking off World War III by doing that, so I'm excluding them. The Ukrainians either don't have necessarily the capability or wouldn't want to detract from their allies or like hurt their potential with their allies of doing that. The Russians might do it as a false flag, and that was my leading theory, but I didn't know who it was, so I was like, I'm not I'm not saying who it is, but my leading theory would have been the Russians. Okay, Grex's one says, what are going to be some of the issues with reintegration of the territory of occupied and Russified, the territory occupied and Russified for the last decade? Yeah, that's tricky. So you have school children that are being taught to hate Ukraine, like that. There are all these Nazis there. And by the way, I have yet, and this is absolutely fascinating to me. I've posed this again and again to hear anyone say, oh, well, so and so is a Nazi, and so is a Nazi, and this one's a Nazi, and that one's a Nazi. The only thing that I've ever heard was they have statues of Bandera and they wear symbols and the Azov battalion. And who the Azov battalion did have a legitimate like Nazi or like right wing, maybe skinhead like kind of inclinations. At first, some of the leaders did, but they were integrated into the military, and that's not a thing now. But to cleanse them of Nazis. Who are the leaders in Ukraine that are Nazis? I can't find any. Like, and nobody on the pro-Russian propaganda side. Like, I have a guy that's popping up in here who says, I called him a Russian troll earlier, and he said, I'm not a Russian troll. I'm a U.S. Army veteran. Okay, but what you're doing is trolling when you're repeating Russian talking points. So I'm not going to continue to fight with, and I'm so aware because I daily read RT and Pravda and other things along these lines. I'm so aware of the Russian talking points, not even going to engage. So now, and if that hurts somebody's feelings, that's too bad. So, but I can't find any any evidence of the Russian propaganda point that there are Nazis in Ukraine running the government, and that's why we have to cleanse them. Now, roll back to World War II. If you said, "Where are the Nazis?" the Germans would be like, here, this guy's a Nazi, he's a Nazi, I'm a Nazi, they're a Nazi, right? They're all Nazis. They would like proudly put. So, is it a conspiracy? Because if it's a conspiracy, then you have a whole different problem set. Because conspiracy theories can be wildly wrong, and to do that, to invade a country on the conspiracy theory, that's a whole different thing than to say, yes, we're all Nazis, hail, right? I mean, that we're in a different place. So, I would love for somebody to show me, oh yes, Polodek or Reznikov or something along those lines. Here's definitive proof that but they can't. They just can't do it. Okay. Uh, Next question. And the corruption with Nord Stream goes deep in my country. I'm assuming that you're German, Arno, when you're saying deep in my country. So honestly, if you weren't dealing with Russia, Nord Stream would seem like a great deal. But because you're dealing with Russia, now you have an issue where you're beholden to Russia for that. I mean, you got cheap oil, you've got under market oil for a long time, but here's who you're dealing with. I do an exercise in my management class where you have to set up a satellite phone. You're looking at various countries, and I give them a list of a dozen or so countries, and you have to set up a satellite's phone distribution in that. But the goal of the project is you have to research the country and understand who it is, like what your market is, what you're dealing with, and among that list are Lithuania and Belarus and Venezuela and Jamaica and I think Palmero. One of the locations is Palmero, Sicily, like Minsk, Belarus, Caracas, Venezuela, and I give them a number of places. And I can tell real quickly if they actually did it because they're like Jamaica is one of them. Ocho Rios, Jamaica. So they're it's looking at these different places, and some places sound great, like, but there's a lot of crime in Jamaica. There's a lot of crime in Sicily. There's a lot of corruption in Caracas, Venezuela. There's a lot so Belarus actually is kind of a crapshoot. Like you can get a sweetheart deal according to the parameters of it, but you're also dealing with Lukashenko who could take your stuff at any time. And so some people are willing to roll the dice and some people aren't. And Lithuania has been one of the big leaders, like one of the best players in this for a long time because they're actually stabilizing since 91. They've gone headlong the right direction. So I say that to say this, the corruption, you're dealing with you said because you were dealing with the Russians, you got the sweetheart deal, but now that you have to know that the Russians were the senior partner in that deal. And same thing here with the students if they're going to go with Belarus as their choice. Okay, I'm skipping that one. Should I add the Azov Battalion tattoo? Yeah. So when we're talking about like who is it that hey Cheryl, how you doing? Um, when I'm looking for evidence, the Azov Battalion, the tattoos, the symbols, like, and I did this episode on my old podcast before I switched over and was like, okay, I got to stop doing this on my Leadersmith podcast. I got to actually go and do it its own channel here, and that's what I've done since. Well, look, he has this on his shirt. He has an Iron Cross. Zelensky did. Well, the Brits have an Iron Cross on it too. They just didn't call it an Iron Cross. They called it the Victoria Cross. You can't take something like that from there. If there's a World War II looking patch, but it's reversed or something, that doesn't mean that these guys are necessarily white supremacist neo-Nazi types. It could just be a cool looking symbol. If you say that the swastika reversed is a symbol that's thousands of years old that goes back to India. It's just like you can't use that as a proxy for this is what they are. If they're saying this is what I am, then believe them. And if they're saying that they're not, until you can prove evidence, don't get into a conspiracy mindset. The whole world's gone nuts with conspiracy mindsets over the last couple of years, whether it's COVID or the Republicans' form of this is the deep state, right? I mean, you just and I'm a Republican. I cringe when I hear, well, the deep state does blah 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 blah. I'm like, come on, guys, like give us some real hard evidence of whatever it is that you're talking about. Okay, at any rate, I'm going to stop with that and move on to the next question. Thanks for bringing up these points about conspiracy theories. No, it's really important because people will buy these conspiracy theories. So love dog. It's really important. I want to make this clear. Conspiracy, you can't regulate your life based on a conspiracy theory or regulate your actions based on a conspiracy theory. If you do that, you're going to run headlong. You're going to think you're doing the right thing and run headlong the wrong direction, or you don't know. It's like running blind through the woods or at night through the woods. You just can't orient yourself properly. I still remember my grandma slapping those magazines at the checkout at my hand, called them rags, and told me to leave them be. Yeah, that's good advice. Um, in fact, going back to what I'm going to be talking about next week, um, one of the things I've been researching was American propaganda or Western propaganda from the pro-Russian side. And conspiracy theories factor into that because if you the same base of conspiracy theory is what allows you to embrace Russian talking points, and if you do that, you have to have a conspiracy theory mindset first to embrace the Russian talking points because there's just not the proof of certain things, and we'll talk about that next week. Okay. Let's see. So yeah, I want to visit the Stephen Bandera Monument in Lviv. Okay, well, Bandera. Here's another one. So we're all mixed bags. I just finished this really interesting book. It was Baba Black Sheep. It was by Pappy Boyington. If you're old like me, I'm roughly 50. If you're about my age, you probably remember if you watch in American TV on Saturday mornings the Black Sheep Squadron and Pappy Boyington, Gregory Pappy. They called him Grandpa because he was like 30 and all the other flyers were 20. Um, was in charge of this battalion. He was shot down. He was captured. He had just tied Eddie Rickenbacker's shoot down rate from World War One, and he was shot down. At any rate, at the very end of the book, he talks about how all his battles with things like alcoholism and other things, and he concludes by saying, "Show me a hero, and I'll show you somebody who's got a bad side," or something along those lines. There's truth to that. That's exactly right. It doesn't matter who that person is. Now, Bandera has he worked with the Nazis. That's true. There's no doubt about that. But he worked with the Nazis because he was trying to his ultimate goal was national liberation for his country. So he would work with the devil himself if he had to. While I say that, Churchill said that if the devil himself was going to denounce Hitler, I'd give him a time to speak to Parliament. Right? So you got to understand, like, there's more to the story than just, oh, Bandera was a Nazi. No, there's more to it. And so while he's a Ukrainian hero for his like pro-Ukrainian nationalism position, the other side uses that and only just the piece of it that he worked with. And what happened the day after, and here's a fact, go look this up. The day after uh, Hitler turned on Russia and invaded Russia, Bandera asked Hitler by letter for Ukrainian independence. He had been working with the Germans, and he fought different directions, but he asked Hitler directly for Ukrainian independence the very next day. Like, this is the way that he was functioning. So, okay, now that doesn't mean he's a great guy. That doesn't mean he didn't do wrong things, but this is why Ukrainians revere him. Okay, so at any rate, I'm not going to belabor that anymore. Okay, love dog, Oklahoma here. Good morning. Cheryl said, watch the behavior and verify. Yeah, there's something to that. Arno, you're absolutely right about the symbols. They don't stand for the ideology, but for being tough and cool. Militaries worldwide have that. Right. I mean, if you turn one of the Azov ones that you're so wild up about, it turns into a Z if you turn it on its side. What does that say? I mean, that's essentially the same stuff. So I wouldn't make a big deal about that. Paul Young says, when your relatives and friends are dying or missing, even Russia will start to think, yeah, but Paul, it doesn't work that way. And I hate to be the one to tell you this, but what's actually happened in Russia is, and I've only seen some preliminary evidence about this, and it might become more, might become less. I don't know. Preliminary evidence shows that as more casualties come back and the Russians start to feel this more, they're actually becoming hardened to the war, being more pro Russia. Like, we have to make this count, right? And there's a psychological thing to this where, like, you want your sacrifice to mean something, and so I think that that actually might harden the resolve of the people. But the people are generally so apolitical that I'm not counting on them. I don't believe that the people in Russia can. I don't think they have the mental resources because they've been so beat down for a century, um, that to rise up and overthrow. If there's any kind of overthrow that's going to come from any quarter, it would have to come from the oligarchs or the military. I don't see that it can come from the people themselves. But the people are actually kind of hardening to the war, which is a really amazing thing to see. Okay, Paul Young, when your relatives, you just read that. Arno, well, there's that saying, "Don't try to explain with malice what can be explained with stupidity." Yeah, I mean there is that. So the symbols are not the best move. It's not the greatest look, but that's not proof of Nazism, right? So, yeah. Stephen Cole, I'm a youngster. You've got 18 years on me. That's fine. So maybe you remember the Black Sheep Squadron. That's why I read the book about Pappy Boyington. Okay, so let me if you have more questions, just pop them into the chat box and I'll try to answer them. In the meantime, I'm going to continue with the questions that were posed to me on the community channel. Other things that you want to hear about are analysis of other prominent Ukrainian leaders, such as Klitko, the mayor of Kiev, Budapest Memorandum, and how it was probably the worst deal ever. Yeah, and I'm doing some background on that. I don't know that I know much about the mayor. He seems like he's a good guy who's trying to do the best he can with a really really hard job. Especially when, I mean, just imagine like how difficult it would be if every time you repaired something that you got a missile strike on it again, and like really, I mean, that has to be deflating. Um, Okay, next question was, you're a specialist to dig a bit deeper, to dig between the lines. Your themes are good as there are enough channels out there who review the daily war news. Simply use a never changing title line to gain more viewers. You're already one of the best channels. I appreciate that. By the way, the list that we created yesterday, I now have, let me see. I now have 189. I didn't even know that there were that many, but there's some duplicates in here. 189 channels, or not channel, yeah. But so YouTube channels. Some put some Telegram channels, but that prompted a whole different thought for me too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first sort out YouTube. Cheryl, you need to email to go to that link and contact me, and so I can get you back into, because you're one of the people that I had in mind. Steven is another that's already there to help me review this list. Um, and so my first thought was, let's find these solid YouTube channels and let's find these not solid, like pro-Russian propaganda channels. Like I had this guy on here earlier that wanted to argue with me about pro-Russian talking points. There are those channels out there that exist, so let's create those. But I wasn't even thinking about Telegram. I wasn't even thinking about like Twitter. So maybe we can replicate this a couple of times and then like put out some really solid things for people like us who want to actually find these things so that we can inform ourselves. Okay, so a couple of other people have popped in here on the chat. As a Russian presbytero, as the Russian army is running out of ammunition, soldiers are feeling there is unfairness in the distribution of ammunition. Sure, yeah, there definitely is. Prigozhin is talking about this, where he's not getting the proper. I absolutely love seeing this, that he's fighting with his own military about getting his supplies, because it's worth easily a company or battalion or brigade or something when they're in fighting instead of working together. I'm not sure exactly how to quantify that, but I think it's a wonderful thing. How could you solve this feeling of unfairness, more transparency? Imagine if this was a business. That's a great line. So you have this problem because the leaders are vying for power. And in a business, you see this, and this is, you're speaking my language now, right? So in a business, it would be like the president says, looks down from above and says, I have these five fingers for five different silos. As long as you're doing your job, it doesn't matter if you're working with him or working with him, as long as you're doing your job, because you're getting credit for having done your job. So if the president is saying you do your job and you get your credit, doesn't matter, then they have no um, incentive to work together. But if the incentive is if he's not getting what he needs because you're not helping him, then you're not actually doing your job. That's different. And that's a healthy organization. And this is what's not happening in Russia. It's just these various silos of it's like, everybody's looking for daddy's affection and I'll get it if I get my stuff squared away. Prigozhin is infighting, and he has an ally in Servakin, but an enemy in Gerasimov, and yeah, so it's a messy kind of thing. How could you solve this feeling of unfairness? More transparency. Imagine if this. We had just read that, Cheryl. forget People forget Stalin also worked with Hitler and carved up Poland with Hitler. A plus. You just you passed the course. That's absolutely right. So for people who want to say Bandera was a Nazi, okay. So Stalin was working with Hitler while Bandera was working with Hitler. So unless you're going to tar Stalin with the same brush, and the other Russian leadership, with it, remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, unless you're going to tar them with the same brush, you have no leg to stand on to talk about Bandera. So, like, let's be honest. Let's just be fair. Be fair this way or be fair this way. Say no, they're not. And I get what Bandera was trying to do. He was working with the enemy of my enemy in order to fulfill his goals, and so was Stalin. Or you say they're both in that same camp, but you can't just cherry pick and do that because that's simply not fair. Okay, absolutely great point, Cheryl. Maurice, hey Doc, hello from Argentina. Oh, Argentina, wow, it's nice to see you. Okay, let me go back to my other questions until you populate some more in the chat. And whoop, there we go, Stephen Cole. Repeating my question regarding possible Russian agent provocateurs causing opposition groups to act stupidly in Bryansk. DIY false flag observations. Did I miss something here? I'm not sure what your question was about that. Please clarify that for me, Stephen, and I'll try to address it. Next question that I had on my list was, I agree with everything you said in the videos and add that it can be especially difficult to not immediately jump on the Russian troll conclusion in the type of brief exchanges of short messages in YouTube comments. I personally have struggled with that. Yeah, so I talked about that last week, and where I was saying, like, don't try to hear or understand things until the point where you recognize whether this is is it pearls before swine? Is it the kind of person that's just going to keep coming back with that kind of thing? I had somebody that started on here today in this one, who has been repeating Russian talking points again and again. And okay, if you're going to repeat the Russian talking points, you're going to. I mean, if that's where you're coming from, I recognize what I'm dealing with. But that's different than somebody when you have not heard that before and you're going, okay, where did this come from? Like that conversation that I had with my daughter. Excuse me, I live in the American South and we have pollen and it's kicking my butt. Sorry. So that's different than like the conversation that I had with my daughter where she was saying something that sounded like that. I'm like, where did that come from? But as I unpacked it, I heard like these were legitimate questions. So let's talk about the legitimate questions. And so you have to figure out what's legitimate and what's not. Sometimes people want to know, and sometimes people just want to argue. And if they just want to argue, life's too short, move on. Okay. Paul Deck said, let's not forget that Stalin tested nukes on his own people. Yeah. And he also had the Holodomor. So, by the way, if you're, let me address that too. In the 1930s, you had the Holodomor, which Stalin was destroying, like genocidally taking from the Ukrainians, starving them to death. So I think anybody after Stalin looks like a better person to work with than Stalin. So, again, in the early 40s, before you knew what Hitler really was, you just knew that he wasn't Stalin and he could protect. If like this, I know this guy's going to kill me. Maybe this guy. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a grain of salt to Bandera. Okay, not that Hitler's good. I did my master's on the Third Reich. I know Hitler's the devil, but if you put it in context, I mean, Stalin was absolute evil to the Ukrainians. Okay, let's not forget that Stalin tested nukes on his own people, Russian citizens, though I understand non-Russian ethnically in the remote villages in the 1950s. That's right. Stalin did some really bad things to and he was particularly not gracious to those that were not ethnic Russians. And by the way, if you look at a map of where people are coming from right now, this is a fascinating map. You just Google it about where the military, who is drafted by ethnicity in Russia for the war in Ukraine, and very few ethnic Russians comparatively from like the Moscow region are actually being sent. It's from all the other ethnic enclaves. The Russians. I heard this from a friend who lived in Russia. Russians are really racist. I mean, like really racist. Like in Russia, it's a multi-ethnic country, but they're really racist against non-Russians. I saw this and I heard this as well when I was in Lithuania back in the Soviet times. Russians had like this extra, like we're all comrades, right? We're all equal, but some are more equal than others, like an animal farm kind of thing. So the Russians that lived in Lithuania were like super first class citizens, and all the Lithuanians had to be subordinate to that. So, and this happened in other Soviet satellites as well. Part of the backlash that Russia is feeling now is that during Soviet times, Russian citizens had some priority. So now, after the Soviet Union disbanded, Russian citizens kind of got the short end of the stick, or Russian speaking ethnic Russians got the short end of the stick. And they got a backlash to the way that they horribly treated the people in the other countries that they were in. And so that was probably true in the Donbass to some degree as well, but not to the degree that it's genocidal or whatever. But it's still, I mean, so there's a little bit of a grain of salt that makes the stereotype work for Putin to be able to say his propaganda. Okay. Um, Next, Love Dog Cedar is killing me now too. I understand. For me, it's pollen where I am. Marie West. Oh yeah, spring has sprung 20 days early and it's killing me. Yeah, it's bad this year. Maurice DeBert, what's your take on the situation in Moldova? I don't know that there's been any more movement in Moldova than there was a week or two ago. It's potentially a powder keg, just like Georgia is potentially a powder keg. Um, I don't know. But look at this. Here's what the question is: if these countries were in NATO, would this have happened? Right? 2008, we came to this place where I think it was 2008, we came to this place where we're like, yeah, in Ukraine and Georgia, you're going to be invited into Ukraine, but not into NATO, but not just yet. Had they actually become part of NATO, this never would have been an issue. This is only an issue. There's only a war because Putin realizes, hey, I can do something about this before they become part of NATO. And so in 2014, when he invaded into Ukraine, he guaranteed that they would not become part of NATO because NATO will not bring them in while there's a conflict within their border. And he knew that. And so if he's saying as a pretext right now that that NATO, they're trying to join NATO and that's why we have to invade now, he's lying. And he knows he's lying. He knows that they can't join NATO as long as he's within the borders. So that's just, it's not true. But again, Georgia is vulnerable. Ukraine is vulnerable. Moldova is vulnerable. Finland and Sweden are vulnerable. And that's why I remember 3 days after the war kicked off, watching the president of Finland, I like nudged my wife like, hey, look, he's got to go to the US right now because he knows that he's vulnerable. And until he gets into NATO, he's getting, man, he's got to get whatever deals he can get to make sure that he has protection. Again, Finland and Sweden. That's a landmass larger than Ukraine. I remember calculating this. And so if Putin was trying to keep NATO like smaller, it kind of backfired because of area larger than Ukraine is now they're trying to join NATO as well. Um, let's see, where were we? Yes, okay. Thank you, Cheryl. Got. I will look for that. Stalin came from Georgia. That's right. He did come from Georgia. Um, I don't know that he oppressed Georgia though. That's different. Cheryl said lots of unconscious bias, unconscious imperialism. My British grandma had the same. Cheryl, it won't surprise you to know that I'm not a big fan of the whole unconscious bias kind of thing. Now, let me unpack that. It's not the unconscious bias that's the issue. It's the what you do if you don't override it. So you're unconscious. If you start with an unconscious bias going one way and you don't override it, you're bad. If you do override it, you're good. And that's what you need to do. You need to check that unconscious bias. But just because you start there doesn't mean you're bad. What you do with it and recognize it and then redirect it, that's what's important. And the Russians just don't simply recognize that. They have almost, and I hate to use this analogy, but it's almost like a Russian MAGA for imperialism. So a Russian make Russia great again, like in an imperialist sense. And that's not really a good thing, but it's like imbued into their the fabric of their culture. And I think, when your hero is Peter the Great, who, by the way, if you read about Peter the Great, oh man, he was a train wreck. I mean, but that's like Putin's hero. Okay. Um, Arlo says, even more evil. I think about the Donbass conscripts forced to fight their family members. Some of them are going willingly, but some of them are conscripts, and that is bad. Outsider inside Russia says, yes, Russians have no problem saying things like, I won't rent my apartment to people from Central Asia or the Caucasus regions, among other things. That's right. I mean, there is a profound racism within Russians. Not all of them. You can't paint everybody. You can't paint anybody from any group with a full, everybody's monolithic. But in general, it is pretty fair to say that ethnic Russians tend to be pretty racist. Okay. Um, great analysis, bro. Hey, thank you, Arthur. Stephen Cole says, question is how to resist being sucked in and used by agent provocateurs to act in a way that's harmful to one's own cause, like January 6th and the FBI. Man, so you have to stand on solid evidence. You can't be sucked in by whatever the conspiracy is. And you can choose a conspiracy from the left or the right. It doesn't matter what the conspiracy is. Um, when I reacted to Cheryl's unconscious bias, I mean, I think the unconscious, the movement of that, the direction of that whole line of thing, I reject. If I say that you're bad and you need to do the work because you're this race and this right, that's that's the same kind of thing as the January 6th kind of, there is a conspiracy here that they've overthrown the election crowd. Both of you have to have more solid evidence than what you're going on. So yeah, you just be fact based, get into the actual facts rather than buying the conspiracy. I'm going to be talking about that conspiracy kind of thing next week. I'm like anti InfoWars. I'm like the opposite of that. You've got to be fact based. Okay. Maurice de Bert, what about Transnistria with Russian presence? It would not surprise me that it breaks away and opens a secondary front. Yeah, I don't know because okay, what Russia's initial game plan was within 3 weeks or something along those lines. They were going to, take the capital within 3 days. They were going to secure the country. They were going to be in Odessa within 3 weeks. And Odessa, once you're there, you're a short step away from Transnistria. So I think the bigger plan was to incorporate that. I don't think that's a practical thing right now, and they can't supply it. Like they can't. There's no supply lines that can get them into Transnistria to be able to do that kind of thing. So I think that is it's still a dream. It's still something that they want. They haven't given up their full ambitions, but I just don't see that they're going to actually be able to do practically do that kind of thing now. Um, well, Maurice said, "Yeah, but Peter the Great knew how to throw a party. Yeah, he also knew how to kill his son and be just terrible in so many other human regards. That he's just an absolute train wreck of a human being. You can look on either Netflix or Prime. I don't remember which. There's a documentary about Peter the Great that if you want to understand him, that's all that you need. And wow, he's just a terrible human being. Okay, at any rate, we're getting down to about 50 minutes, and so I'm going to be done in the next 5 minutes or so. I'll answer whatever questions you have left. This is a kind of a last bit. If you want to ask any question about anything whatsoever related to Ukraine, I'll do what I can to answer, and then we're going to be done. My voice can only hang on but so much longer because of the pollen. So, um, all right. So, last couple questions here. Russia is still big mad for Napoleon and Hitler. Ironically, they allied. Sorry, and Hitler ironically allied both. Um, yeah. So again, part of the Russian psyche is we don't feel this in America because we're kind of far away across the ocean. But the Russians do have this kind of psyche, and I'm reading this really interesting book. I'm knee deep in it right now. I got to look up the name of it. I'm listening on audio. Um, it is about like Russia's mentality, and it's really interesting because they do have this idea like we're about to be invaded. It's called Russia, uh, a story of war. But they do have this concept like we're going to continually be invaded. We have to guard the borders. Well, part of the problem is you have too much land mass, and so now that is has become a problem. You're not isolated. Like the UK is safe across the channel. The US is safe across the ocean. So but they do feel that France feels it, you know, this insecurity more just like Russia does. But Russia invaded by the Mongols, invaded by the Finns and the Swedes and the Germans and whoever. But again, they've also been the aggressors to others as well. So, but they're only focused on one side of the equation. Oh, we have to defend ourselves. How are you defending yourselves? By attacking another nation and trying to take more of their land. So once you incorporate, like, okay, so the Donbass was supposed to be this buffer area to defend against Russia and have this buffer state, but now you just created it and made it part of Russia. So you need another buffer beyond that so that you can have this buffer state between you and Russia. So it'll just keep going on. That's how we're good at lying to ourselves about things and rationalizing about things. And so that's kind of what they're doing. Okay. Last couple questions. If you have anything else, get them up there real quick. What do you think about Prigozhin? He wants to run as president of Ukraine. No, I don't think Prigozhin is thinking anything about president of Ukraine. I think initially what might have happened, and this is from my reading. This isn't speculation, and it could be wrong, but like Medvedchuk could have been installed in Zelensky's place, or the previous president could have been installed in Zelensky's place as a puppet governor, kind of like what they were trying to do to Russia to make a pro-Russian government. That was in the early plans, but that doesn't look like that's going to happen at this point. I was reading about how we're not. This was an RT article not long ago. We have no plans to kill Zelensky. I mean, this idea that he was going to be assassinated. Well, you couldn't, because the Soviet era tunneling system under Kiev was about as complex as it is under Moscow from Cold War, and so Zelensky was pretty protected. You simply couldn't do that. That's why you say you have no plans from them. Um, let's see. Rosen's drunken rant yesterday was hilarious. He has a lot of hilarious drunken rants. Cool. Thanks a lot. Thanks. I'll go check it out. Raspberry says, thank you from your friendly Canadian neighbors. Canadians, we talk about culture, and Canadians do have this like friendly kind of vibe. I actually went up on a cruise into Canada on my honeymoon, and they were like a little too nice. I mean, like, oh, well, thanks for coming to visit. It was so nice to see you. I'm like, whoa, like I'm just not used to that level of nice. Hello, Canadians. Stephen Cole, Arthur Ray covered the Prigozhin rant. Yeah, I mean, go check that out. he's an interesting character. Arno says throughout history, Russia craved for recognition and never had anything to show for it. To me, that's the core. Well, no, it's not that they don't have anything to show for it. I mean, they actually grabbed a huge landmass. If I have my facts correct, and I was building this for another video that I just haven't put out yet, they have acquired over in 150 years every year the landmass of Denmark. I'm pretty sure it's Denmark. The size of the real estate, the area of Denmark, 150 years in a row, they added to their territory. So it's not that they never had anything to show for it. They were pretty aggressive. They talk about we've never colonized. No, you colonized your neighbors. That's what you did, and incorporated it into your country. So yeah, at any rate, okay. So last little bit, and we'll be going here shortly. I'm just going to read the last questions until it stops, and then I'm going to say thank you and hang up here. Maurice DeBert says, reading the book of Guns of August. Yeah, that was a great book, right? And have a creeping feeling of escalation coming. You can get into that, but I think the Biden administration has been very careful. I give Biden very low marks for stopping the war, because before the war we were projecting weakness, especially the way that we left Afghanistan. And as we got closer and closer, Biden seemed to get more serious about it. And maybe it was too little, too late by the time that he was getting there. But I give him very high marks for after the war trying to balance things. So I'm being as fair as possible. And I know people will be like, "Well, you're just a Republican." Look, if I was a Republican during World War II, I could still think that Hitler was the devil and oppose FDR domestic policy, right? I mean, you can do that. Okay, John Bacani said, "Hello from Puerto Rico. Always enjoy your videos." Yeah, Puerto Rico strikes me funny. If uh, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, it's not a state; it's a federal territory. And if this is only speculative, I'm not saying that we should do this or anything along those lines. But so please hear the caveat. But it would be quite a thing if Ukraine, and I'm not saying that they want to do this or they should do this, if Ukraine decided, hey, we want to become part of the United States, where do we sign? And then Russia would have United States federal territory right on the border of Russia. That would be something. I was just I think weird things. My head just goes into various different places, but that would be kind of an upsetting thing for Russia. I not saying that should or would or is anyway, but anyway. Okay. Uh, last couple things. Scar and Mom, good morning. Paul Young says, beware the orange meanie in 2024. I'm assuming that you're talking about Trump. And so let's not bring any other political stuff in that we don't need to, unless it relates to Ukraine. But as it relates to Ukraine, we can probably say Trump's not the best plan for Ukraine. I don't think that while he was in power, Putin would have done this. And again, to a man, I don't know a Republican who thinks that that would have happened. Now, there's two schools of thought on that. One school of thought is that Putin was letting Trump kind of, well, there's two schools of thought. One is that Trump was Putin's puppet. I reject that. There's a second school of thought that I think has a little bit more to it, and that is that Putin saw Trump as kind of like blowing up NATO, and go ahead, let him continue to do this. I'm not going to do anything while he's going and actively doing this for his own reasons. Like, I'm not going to stop him. Let him keep doing that. And then there's a third school of thought, and most Republicans are in this third school of thought, and that is like his ego would not have let him allow this to happen. Like he's wanting to do a deal, but he's not going to allow on his watch it to look bad and him go down in history as the guy that let this happen. So like he's not a hawkish kind of Republican like most Republicans. Like, I'm a Reagan Republican, right? Um, but I still, that's the way Republicans see it as opposed to the way Democrats see it. But we're not here to talk about Trump unless it's directly related to the war. But I think Trump would be a unfortunate choice for the president for the purposes of Ukraine. And now DeSantis has picked out a middle ground somewhere in there. Nikki Haley is actually full-throatedly supporting Ukraine. She's a Republican candidate. Mike Pence has fully throatedly supported Ukraine. So there's a spectrum within the party. Again, no group is monolithic, and the amount that I hear from the left about how Republicans don't support Ukraine, it's overblown. It really is. Most Republicans that I know support Ukraine, and then there are some that bought the Russian talking points, and I'm still trying to figure those out. Okay. Marie West, I hope you're feeling better. Thank you for the talk. Lovely Saturday. Thank you. John Pagati said, but we are not bad people. I don't know who the we is. John, if you, I don't remember. Hello from Puerto Rico. No, you're not bad people. No, I wasn't saying that you're bad people. That was not my point at all. Arno, funny. I had the same daydream of Poland and Ukraine uniting when the war started. Yeah, you might be onto something, Arno, because something that's going to be happening geopolitically within the EU afterwards. So the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Baltic states, and the Poles have been really pro-Ukraine, very supportive of Ukraine. Well, there's going to be, and the Poles, particularly this Polish government, does not like the German government, and they don't get along very well. And there's going to be a seismic shift when there's a Eastern European bloc that can rival the weight that Germany has been able to throw around in the EU. That is the Baltic states and Poland and Ukraine all coming together will be a sizable counterbalance in the EU. So you're going to just watch for that down the line. So you're onto something with that. Okay, Scar and Mom, do you think Russia should be banned from the Olympics? Man, that's a tough question. I don't know. I don't know whether I want them to, turn their backs and boo them, or whether I want them to ban. I just want the war to stop. I mean, I want the Russians to be beaten on the battlefield, the war to stop, and then we can start to rebuild and get on with life. I have mixed feelings about that. It's kind of like, do you want Russians to be able to get out of the country, or do you want them to have to stay there and have to protest their own government? I was on the side of I want them to get out. Every man that gets out, the million men that fled out of the country, I thought was a great thing, not a terrible, like, I understand Zelensky's position. Like, he wants them to stay there and have to oppose their own government, but that's not realistic. I want them to get out and not fight in Ukraine. So I have mixed emotions. Trump's understanding of Ukraine is 20 years out of date. Yes, that's correct. And his understanding of Russia is filtered through he's not listening to John Bolton and others along those lines. He's thinking, I can make a deal with whoever I can make a deal with him. And that's Trump's big problem. He doesn't have the handle on policy like he should, because he still sees himself through the deal maker lens. Okay, having only Biden or Trump as options, doesn't it make you wish for another option? Yeah, and I don't think that it's only going to be those options. If I was a betting man, Arunas, I would say that either Biden or Trump will not be the candidate for their party going forward, and it's probably going to be somebody else in 2024 in one or both of those parties. And Cheryl said, yes, Ben Hodges. Ben Hodges, anytime he speaks, listen. John Picotti, I love Gerald Ford and Papa Bush. They would have supported Ukraine. That's right. Reagan would have been like, how much ammunition do you need? Right? What exactly do you need? How can we support you? The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that included Ukraine, or big parts of Ukraine. That's correct. I mean, most people don't even know their history enough to know that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was like the dominant force for like a century or more. But trying to get political, or not trying to get political, I'm independent for a reason. Okay, that's great. And here, I don't care if you're independent, if you're left-wing, if you're right-wing, it doesn't matter as long as you support Ukraine. Thanks for the talk. Poland, Ukraine, economic cooperation, Baltic, Black Sea transportation will benefit both. But you just triggered a fascinating thought. China has a vested interest in Ukraine because of the the new Silk Belt and what the where they want to put the Silk Belt, the train that would go through the economic cooperation. It would part of one of the schematics for it will run through Ukraine to Moscow, and so China has an interesting vested interest in this moving forward. So they're not getting involved like I don't know what China's play is, but they want to get to the other side where they can have their business set up through that. Just look for the China Belt Road, and you'll see in certain schematics it goes right up through down through Turkey and over and up through Ukraine to Moscow. They want to get past this war so they can get to that. So just something to look for. Um, Okay. Poland, Ukraine economic cooperation. I too wanted the Russians to get out, save their lives. Absolutely. I wish for another option too. Love Ben Hodges. Recommend Polish move with fire and sword. Okay, this is the last comment that I'm going to read, and then we're going to be done because we're over an hour. Lithuanians are not too fond of another Poland-Lithuania, but this conflict did repair Lithuanians' relations with Poland and create a lot of solidarity between us and the Baltics and the Nordics. Okay, so thank you. Okay, I said I was only going to read this. This is the very last comment I'm going to read. Arno said, "Don't mention China. You're in the stream for the unless you want the stream to last for another 3 more hours." Okay, I'm done. Thank you for your time. Thank you all for being the kinds of people that care about Ukraine.